A photographer's style is not just in what they shoot, but in how they see the world. It's the unique fingerprint of their vision. Now, that's an anonymous quote about photography style. And in this podcast, I want to talk about styles, particularly photography styles, and how they relate both to different decades, because you can look at certain photographs and there will be things about them that will point to a particular decade and point to a particular time when they were shot. But also as individuals, as photographers, we each have our own style. We might not be conscious of it. We might be becoming more conscious of it as we take more photographs. But I think that's one of the really positive things about photography, that our style will change, whether it's conscious or subconsciously, that it will change. But it will change over time because we learn different things. We're inspired by different people. We get new ideas and we have different experiences. So that's really the purpose of this podcast. I'm going to talk through a few things relating to style that I hope you find interesting and maybe will inspire you a little bit in developing your own photography. But before I do that, the usual reminder, just please like and subscribe. That would be fantastic. And it just helps me to continue to do these podcasts if you find them useful. And you're also very welcome to either subscribe to the podcast or to jump onto the website and buy me a coffee. That would be lovely. Okay, so I'm going to start by just talking through chronologically perhaps things that define individual decades. So I'm going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And I'll just kind of touch on really highlights from what was going on there, because a style, in my opinion, is a combination of two things. It's what's going on socially, and it's also restricted perhaps by what's available in terms of technology. So if we look at the 1900s up to about the 1910s, really we're looking at the birth of modern photography. So obviously, people were taking photographs for several decades before that, but you're looking at glass plates, you're looking at very bulky gear, usually pretty long exposure times, that kind of thing. So, and for a lot of people at that time, photography was something of a specialist activity. It's kind of like, I know I was talking to some friends about cars yesterday, having a beer as we do on a Friday night, and we were talking about these diagnostic machines that you now plug into a modern car engine and you can find out all sorts of things about what's going on with the engine. And that stuff is pretty powerful, but also it's quite specialized. Although on the market these days, there are more and more things that are coming into the sort of budget that perhaps the car enthusiast would be able to afford to do that kind of diagnostic and perhaps reprogramming on their engine. So if we sort of take that parallel and put it back to photography, I would say that the early days of photography, you're probably looking at the really expensive, more specialized gear. And it was really the hobby of people who had the money to indulge in it. And what I'm really interested in is people who do it for a hobby, kind of ordinary people. So again, not people who have a photographic studio and do it as a business, but if you just shoot photography because you love doing it. So that would take us to the 1900s, the 1910s. What are we looking at? Probably pictorialism would define the style. Characteristically, you're probably looking at things like soft focus, maybe images that are more influenced by paintings at the time than other photographs. You might be looking at romantic, you might be looking at more atmospheric scenes, but there are fewer photographers around. Alfred Stieglitz is one who was working at that time and probably aiming to establish photography more as a fine art. So the kind of gear that they would be using at that stage would still be these very large format cameras, probably using a glass negative. And moving to the 1920s and 30s, we go into people like Ansel Adams, who's probably better known. And I think most of us would recognize an Ansel Adams landscapes, black and white landscapes. And here things are developing. We're starting to get, there's a more modern or modernistic flavour to the photographs, and also a more documentary aspect to them. So you're starting to look at technology which is delivering smaller, or relatively smaller, more portable cameras. So obviously once you start doing that, you can start, it's much easier to get out to shoot landscapes and things like that. And also the number of people who can afford to buy a camera is getting much larger as well. So in the 1920s, if you think about it, the characteristics, we're looking at abstraction, maybe more industrial forms, experimental angles. So that whole creativity aspect is starting to grow. And that sits alongside the sort of Bauhaus influence. If you look at what's going on in architecture, of course, the name now has gone completely out of my head, as it would. But there you go. That's the joys of doing a podcast live. But that style, that kind of 1920s and 1930s style, is very distinctive. And if you look at even the design of locomotives and things like that, you get these amazing streamlined locomotives. So there was a very strong art movement going on. Okay, once you move into the 40s, we're obviously looking into the decade that's dominated by the Second World War for most cultures in one form or another. So what you're seeing there, first of all, you've got the development of 35mm cameras. They're very portable now. They can be taken to the battlefield, to where the action's happening. And you've also got a development in flash photography. So we're seeing gear that is recognizable to us today as being the kind of cameras that we would use. Obviously, most of us are using digital these days, but if you take a step back from digital, the actual look of the cameras is very similar to what we have today. And certainly if you think back to your parents or grandparents, definitely those cameras would be recognizable. So we're looking at photojournalism, war photography. It is much more, a lot of it is very gritty. It's very much documentation. And I mean, there's the Robert Capa photograph taken during the Spanish Civil War. That was in the late 30s. But even so, that kind of image has become very representative. And obviously there are many images from the Second World War. And if you think of some of the really horrendous events that were happening, so the Holocaust, the genocides that were going on, those were documented in a way photographically that was never really possible before. So that style would reflect that decade. And then as we move into the 1950s, you're kind of swinging the other way, because you've got this almost a reaction to having gone through the events of the 1940s. There's this sort of hard swing to the other extreme, where you're looking at glamour, you're looking at how people live. There's this growth of the suburban landscape and culture. I mean, that had already been happening, certainly in the UK, which I'm more familiar with really the advent of, around London, the underground, but the development of transport, trains, that sort of thing. So you started to get the suburbs. People could work in a city but not necessarily have to live in a city, because it was practical to commute every day. So the 50s, you're definitely looking at really it's probably the golden age of magazine photography. If you think of glossy magazines, so it's stylized portraits, it's stylized lifestyle, it's fashion, those kind of things. So the sort of magazines that would come to the fore would be Life, which was, again, very active in the 1940s. But then you've got magazines like Vogue. And if you think of those kind of magazines, the 1950s is definitely where that kind of photography really came to the fore. And there's a more optimistic, arguably a more materialistic aspect to that photography, but it definitely defines the style of the 1950s. If you go into the 60s, you've got the kind of counter culture movement developing. So musically, you've got the Beatles, you've got the Rolling Stones, all that sort of stuff. Obviously, late 50s, you've got Elvis Presley, you've got the whole rock and roll thing. So culturally, there's a huge shift, and you're moving away from the more traditional kind of culture where it's very much about family, it's about hierarchy. In the 60s, you definitely got the counterculture movement, and that's reflected in the photography. So there is much greater use of color, candid street photography, youth culture is a big aspect of it. And color photography in the 1960s was definitely becoming much more available to everybody. So if you've got family portraits from that time, you would probably see a transition from black and white that would have been more likely, certainly the case in the 30s and 40s, possibly into the 50s, but definitely once you start moving into the 60s, you're likely to have a lot more color photographs. And then with the 70s, you've got, again, a kind of swing back more to sort of more gritty photographs, more introspective photographs. There was a lot of social growth and discontent at the time. I mean, if you think to the US, you've got the emancipation of black people, basically, was going on through the 60s and 70s. You've got Vietnam going on. You've got all of the protest that was going on with younger people, particularly against what the establishment was doing. And wherever you're listening to this, I'm sure in your own history, there are examples. So photographically, there's, again, a real connection with realism, telling stories. It's in some ways photojournalism, you could argue, is much, much stronger. In the 60s and 70s, you're looking at color photographs. So there's a lot of change, and what you're seeing in the 70s is definitely a growth of what was beginning in the 60s. So that whole counterculture movement. Now, once we get to the 80s, really if you were around in the 80s, then yuppies and that kind of thing. But it was all about money. It was about success. It was about excess. It was about definitely very strong on materialism. Glamorous, so the sort of glam rock stuff that was going on from the late 70s, and then the 80s developed their own style musically. So you've got this kind of very strong glamour look to what was going on, this sort of larger than life aspect to what was going on socially. So a lot of use of color, lighting, a lot of heavily stylized images in fashion and advertising. So Annie Leibovitz is somebody who stands out in terms of photographers of the time with celebrity portraits. Helmut Newton, very, very distinctive with his fashion shots, if you want to look him up and see what he was doing. So in terms of the mood of the photographs, you're looking very much at the reflection of materialism and very much opulent. So the 80s was very much that kind of very much glamour, I think, would sum up the 80s, but definitely if you were around in that time. And I think Vogue and Madonna and those kind of things too. In the 1990s, you're looking again at swinging back again towards minimalism, grunge, that kind of thing. So we're looking more unfiltered, more raw, perhaps understated images as a style. So photojournalism is again big, more gritty photojournalism, no use of natural light, minimalistic aesthetic in terms of fashion. What are you seeing in trends? So street photography and subcultures definitely coming to the fore much more in the 90s. And of course, the 90s is where digital photography began to emerge. And there's definitely a retro movement right now to use those very early digital cameras, or at least replicate the style. So if you think about it, you've got very low resolution photographs and they have their own look. And you can think about the looks of different photographs. In the 1970s, I always think about more kind of washed out color photographs because the color technology, the films, the print technology wasn't as good as we have now. So again, with the 1990s, you've got those very early digital photographs. Moving into this century, into the 2000s, obviously the key change there, technology-wise, is the rapid growth of DSLRs and also things like Photoshop. So again, the whole post-processing capabilities that you had available were very different. So when you were using film, you could do your own developing. You could mask aspects of the photograph to bring out different aspects of it. But there was a huge amount of skill there, and I would say that probably the majority of photographers weren't really doing that. Once you get to digital photography, though, with things like Photoshop, post-processing becomes much, much easier to do. And it's almost now just a standard part of taking a photograph. So in the days of film, you would do all your composition, you would do your cropping, you would do all of that through the viewfinder. And ideally, once you hit the shutter button, that was it. That was the photograph. It's almost the reverse now with digital photography, or at least I would argue, that you take the photograph, but with the wide variety of post-processing tools and the ease of use, and they are really easy to use compared to what ran before, that ease of use makes that post-processing almost the second part of taking a photograph. And those two parts go together before you get the final image. So that was definitely happening in the 2000s. And you'll start to see the change in the definition of images. And of course, editing allows you to experiment a lot more as well. So the 2000s definitely opened the door to post-processing and to the exploration of photography, but through the digital technology. So it's a different approach to what we have today. And then moving into the 2010s and into the current decade, you've got, I would say, a much stronger emphasis on social media, because looking back to 2010, and I can never quite remember when things came out, but obviously you've got the adoption of Facebook, you've got Instagram, you've got, TikTok on the movies these days, you've got Pinterest. So in terms of the platforms and how we communicate with one another, that has been a big revolution in the last couple of decades, over the last couple of decades, in how we communicate. And obviously that's had a big impact on how we share information. And then the other aspect to that has been the huge advancements in the capabilities of smartphones. So going back to early portable phones, so the old Nokias, things like that, you might have had a very basic camera, but the ability to share photographs was very limited. Whereas now, sharing photographs is just something we do without really even thinking about it, or sharing videos. And smartphones have definitely grown a huge amount. And I would argue that they've pretty much killed the compact camera market. So these days, we would use DSLRs perhaps. There are bridge cameras which have the lenses built in. But in terms of the compact cameras that we used to use, I would argue that really mobile phones, smartphones, have killed that market, because you're walking around. Most of us carry our smartphones with us because we have so much stuff on them these days. They're not just for in fact, probably making phone calls is one of the things you use it for the least. But you're sending messages, whether it's an SMS, if you're even using those these days, it's more the case that you'd be using a WhatsApp, something like that to message. You can share images, documents, anything you want to do. You've probably got banking information on your phone, apps to get you from A to B, whatever it might be. You know, there's so much stuff now that we can do on the phone. And that also has a huge impact on our photography and how we approach photography. So in some ways, we probably have swung back to taking photographs and then not doing anything with them, just popping them straight onto social media, because that's a very easy way of just sharing what we're doing with people, and kind of promoting our own brand, if you want to use it that way. So obviously, brand is really big if you're looking at photography from a business perspective, but just our individual brand as people, we will tend to share certain things. So it might be what we're doing. I mean, a lot of people are really interested in food and will do food photos. But also there are social causes. So going back to what's happening socially, certainly as I record this, in the last few years in Europe, in the US, many other countries, there's been a shift towards the right. So it's almost like what we were seeing, or what people alive at the time had seen in the 1930s, with the growth of fascism and that kind of thing happening, and how that was perhaps documented, but to a very limited degree, because we didn't have the technology and the communications platforms to really follow it. It would have been newspapers, radio broadcasts would have been the main things. Television was really in its absolute infancy at the time. Whereas today, if you look at how social media is manipulated and images, all that kind of thing, it's a very different time. But in many ways, there's a parallel to what was going on in the 30s. So again, what we photograph, what we choose to share will reflect our views, our beliefs, and it's a social commentary that we're all making. So I've sort of skipped through the decades a little bit, and to be honest, I probably talked about that longer than I'd intended. So how do we apply that back to our style? What is our personal style? So one of the really good things I think about photography is that we each individually can grow, we can create different things, we can innovate in our own way, and we can choose to take advantage of the latest technology, whether that's in the camera and what the camera will deliver. So a lot of the technology in cameras is really handy, particularly speaking as a wildlife photographer, but also in the post-processing side, what we can do there. And obviously we've got AI coming along, it's arrived. And I would say really even in the last year or so, what AI is capable of doing has really changed a lot. And I would say we've moved out of the infancy of AI, and we're more in the kind of adolescence of it, because the capability of AI, we see a lot of AI generated images around, and it's becoming harder to tell which images are AI generated and which ones aren't. It's still possible to tell the difference. I'm not saying that, but certainly the ways of identifying it have changed a lot. So how do we use AI in our photography? And then, of course, you get back to ethical issues. And the ethical issues have been there for a while when you go back to things like Photoshop. And I've had this conversation a number of times. I've also put out podcasts on it. I covered it in training. So, what are the ethics? Well, again, I would say that the ethics come back down to what is your intent when you use this technology. Is your intent to convey, as far as you can, what you saw, and to perhaps a more limited extent, what the emotional impact of seeing whatever it is you photographed, what that was on you? Or is your intent to deceive? It essentially is your intent to lie and manipulate, maybe, we see a lot about interference in elections these days, so maybe that's the intent. So, what do we do as photographers? Well, my belief is that your photography will reflect your personality. If you are pretty straightforward as a person, if you are an honest person, if you want to genuinely convey what you see going on, then there's not really an ethical dilemma, I would suggest. However, if you are basically dishonest, you want to manipulate people, all of that kind of thing, you're probably not even asking the question. So that to me is the other side of it. So the whole ethics issue is a really important one. I think it in current times it's actually becoming more and more important, because the technology available to deceive, or that can be used to deceive, has become much stronger. So when it comes to your style, probably got off track a little bit there, but you can use technology. You can go back to the styles that were used in earlier decades, and perhaps you may find some of those resonate with what's going on for you at the moment. And that style perhaps is a more powerful way of conveying what the meaning that you want your images to have. Constraints, obviously, is one of the things I've been talking about, so that will develop a style. So one of the things on projects is to just use one lens to do your photography, just using the prime lens, for example. So by introducing constraints to your photography, you can also develop a particular style or an aspect of your photography, maybe produce a photo book with a particular style, and it's all based on using a single prime lens, and you've shot maybe urban, if urban is your thing, or whatever you normally do. Storytelling is a big thing. So there is a lot of cultural change right now. There are a lot of changes going on. We live in very uncertain times right now. So storytelling, I think, is even more important than it was maybe 10, 20 years ago, because we are in quite clearly very uncertain times. So being able to tell that story for your children's children, to perhaps have some clearer understanding of what it was like to experience these kind of times, is, I think, very important. Looking purely at style, you've got the aesthetics you can use as an inspiration. So you could be maybe looking for something a bit more gritty, something like the 1970s, where there was that kind of gritty aesthetic. Again, at a time where there was a lot of change going on. Or you might be inspired by the 80s with that, almost that, the culture of excess, bright colors, everything's over the top. That could be a style you go for. I think the key thing, and perhaps to sum up, is to think about vision. So arguably, and I would say this is true, photography is definitely as much about vision as it is about tools. And I would actually say it's probably more than that, because what are the tools there for? And by tools, I mean the camera that you're using, any software you might be using, or whatever else contributes to the image that you finally produce. Photography, to me, and the way I teach photography, I teach it in 4 stages. And the very first one is the vision. It's, what are you trying to convey? What is the outcome that you're looking for? Because if you know that, then the second stage is the acquisition of the image. That's what you shoot on the camera. The third stage is what you do in post-processing. So that's Photoshop or whatever you're using. Those all come together. So really, you start with the vision and then shooting the image on the camera, and whatever you do with it in post-processing, they are both there to support the vision and to produce a final result which conveys that vision. It respects the vision. The fourth stage is the bit where you let go of it, and this is where it becomes art, because this is where somebody else looks at it and they will apply meaning to that image based on their life experience. So they're looking through the lens of their own life experience. You obviously have created it, and your vision, your lens is driven by your own life experience and what it is that you hope to convey. But what's received by the viewer is obviously done through the filter of their life experience, and that can be very different. So I guess to conclude, I hope that hasn't totally baffled you. But I think, coming back to why do we do photography? Why do we take a photograph? For me, it's to convey something. If I'm photographing wildlife, I want to give people the view of an animal that they can relate to. And in relating to that animal, because what drives my photography is primarily conservation, because the wildlife that I photograph, most of it is endangered to one extent or another. Some of it is critically endangered, some of it less so. But the way things are going, the way we behave as a species, we're likely to drive pretty much everything towards extinction. And the reality is that many of the animals that we take for granted now, elephants, giraffe, lions, tigers, there is still a very significant chance that in a few decades' time they will be extinct. So I guess to quote David Attenborough, if you are photographing with a view to get people to care about these animals and to do something, help people who are trying to save them, whether it's to support a project or to lobby your government or whoever it might be, if you don't care about an animal, you're not going to do anything to support it. And the way to care about it is to feel some sort of connection with it. And people who go on safari, a lot of people, when they experience animals in the wild, will feel a connection to them. But there are a lot more people who maybe just simply can't afford to go or won't have that experience. And this, to me, is where photography comes in. And so the images I try to shoot are images where people can feel a connection to that image. Now, so that's my vision, I suppose, the broad vision. And then there'll be a more specific vision for each shot. Whatever you do, I hope that resonates with you in that whatever drives your photography, and it may just be, it could be family history, for example. Your family might be, hopefully, is really important to you. And recording different things that happen as your family grows. It's great to document that so that you can look back on it, and then people that come in the future, when they look at those photographs, the names and dates mean something more than just names and dates and family tree. Or you may have another passion. It might be political, it might be something else. But whatever your passion is, if you understand the tools that you're using, which is the purpose of photography training that I offer, you can also use a style that may help you to communicate to your viewer more effectively. And one of the places we can go to get inspiration with our style is the past, and to just look at the kind of styles that defined different decades and what was going on in those decades. So that is it for this podcast. As I say, I hope that has been useful. I thought in this podcast, I try a slightly different take on what I normally talk about in the podcast. So I hope it's been useful, and please like, comment. Please do comment if you've got suggestions as well, or any feedback is really useful. If this kind of podcast is the sort of thing you like, that's great. If you hate it, let me know. It's all good. So that is it, and I'll speak to you in the next podcast. Bye for now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Now, I just want to say thank you for tuning in and joining me in the Wildlife and Adventure Photography podcast. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please give me a like, a subscribe, maybe tell your friends, and by all means leave a comment. And if there is a subject you would like me to cover in the future, please let me know, and I'll be very happy to do my best. So thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next podcast. Bye for now.